Imagine standing on the shores of North Africa in the year 146 before the Common Era. The air is thick with smoke, not the ordinary kind from cooking fires or temple incense, but the black, choking plume of a city burning to its foundations. For 17 days, the screams have faded, replaced by the crackle of collapsing beams, the hiss of molten metal cooling in the ruins, and the silence of a people erased. Before you lies Carthage, once a glittering maritime empire, mistress of the Western Mediterranean, builder of the first true commercial superpower the world had ever seen. Now it is rubble. Ordered by the Roman Senate, commanded by the general Scipio Aemilianus, and justified by decades of fear, hatred, and political maneuvering, Rome has done the unthinkable. It has not merely defeated Carthage, it has sought to unmake it. Stone by stone, ship by ship, memory by memory. They salted the earth, not literally, as legend later claimed, but symbolically, through systematic erasure. No Carthaginian child would be born in this city again. No Punic tongue would echo in its streets. The gods of Tanit and Baal Hammon would receive no more offerings here. And yet, even as the fires raged, even as Scipio stood weeping at the sight of this destruction, a haunting thought crept into the minds of those who witnessed it. Had Rome just killed the one force that kept it honest, disciplined, and strong? Because for over a century, Carthage had been more than an enemy. It had been Rome's mirror, its rival, its measuring stick. Without Carthage, what would Rome become? A republic of virtue and duty, or an empire drunk on unchecked power? This story begins not in 146, but more than 100 years earlier in the uneasy peace that followed the First Punic War. Carthage, already a titan of trade, had lost Sicily to Rome, along with thousands of men and a vast fleet. But rather than collapse, Carthage adapted. Under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca, its most brilliant general, it turned westward, carving out a new dominion in Iberia, what we now call Spain. There, among silver mines and fertile river valleys, Carthage rebuilt its wealth and its military machine. And it was there, in the shadow of those Iberian hills, that a young boy named Hannibal knelt before his father and swore an oath that would shape the destiny of two civilizations. "I swear eternal hatred to Rome," he vowed, a promise sealed not just in words but in his very blood. By the time he was a man, Hannibal would lead an army across the Alps, something no one believed possible, with elephants, cavalry, and infantry drawn from a dozen nations, striking at the heart of Rome and Italy like a storm from the north. For 15 long years, he walked across Roman soil almost unchallenged, defeating legion after legion at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae, where in a single day he slaughtered over 50,000 Roman soldiers in one of the most brilliant tactical encirclements in military history. Rome trembled, families mourned. The Senate debated surrender, and yet Rome did not break. It refused to negotiate. It raised new armies. It adopted a strategy of exhaustion, avoiding direct battle while slowly choking Carthaginian supply lines. Eventually, Hannibal was called back to defend his homeland, and at Zama, in 202 BCE, he faced the man who would become his opposite, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. There on African soil, Rome won the Second Punic War, not through superior numbers but through adaptability, cavalry support from Numidian allies, and a discipline forged in despair. Carthage survived, but barely. Stripped of its navy, forbidden to wage war without Roman permission, burdened by a crushing indemnity, it was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Yet astonishingly, Carthage rebuilt, peacefully this time, through commerce, not conquest. Within 50 years, its granaries overflowed, its markets buzzed, its fields produced so much grain that it became one of Rome's most reliable suppliers. Roman senators watched this revival with growing unease. How could a defeated enemy prosper so quickly? Was this not proof that Carthage's spirit was unbroken? Enter Cato the Elder, the stern, gravel-voiced statesman who saw in Carthage's recovery not a triumph of resilience, but a threat to Rome's survival. From the floor of the Senate, he ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same chilling phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. At first, few agreed. Many Romans, including Scipio Africanus himself, argued that a peaceful Carthage was useful, even necessary. It kept Roman generals humble. It reminded citizens of the cost of arrogance. It served as a trading partner and a buffer against other powers in Africa. But fear is a stubborn seed. And when Carthage, provoked by repeated raids from Rome's Numidian allies, finally took up arms in self-defense, violating the treaty that forbade war without Roman consent, Rome had its excuse. Not because Carthage attacked Rome, but because it dared to defend itself. The Senate declared war in 149 BCE, not a war of conquest but of extermination. Roman legions landed on African shores with overwhelming force, yet Carthage, against all odds, resisted. For 3 years, its people, civilians, women, former merchants turned soldiers, held the walls of their city with desperate courage. They melted down temple statues to make weapons. They wove armor from hair and linen. They burned their fleet to prevent it from falling into Roman hands, then fought from the docks with whatever they had left. The siege became a test not just of arms, but of will. Inside the city, starvation set in. Outside, Roman commanders squabbled and failed, until Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, took command. He was a man of contradictions, cultured, thoughtful, fluent in Greek, yet ruthless in war. He tightened the blockade, built a mole to seal the harbor, and slowly strangled the city from within. When the final assault came in the spring of 146 BCE, it was not quick. Street by street, house by house, Romans advanced through a labyrinth of fire and ruin. The last defenders, cornered in the temple of Eshmun, chose to burn themselves alive rather than surrender. Scipio watched it all from a hillside. And there, as the flames consumed the last heart of Punic civilization, he wept. Not out of pity alone, but because he saw something others could not. That Rome, in its triumph, had crossed a threshold. That by destroying its greatest rival, it had removed the one force that had forced it to be better. That without an external check, power would corrupt from within. He reportedly quoted Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." Then he turned to his friend, the Greek historian Polybius, and asked, "Do you think this could one day happen to Rome?" The fall of Carthage did not end with fire and ash. It echoed through the centuries, reverberating in the laws of Rome, the consciences of its leaders, and the slow, creeping rot that would one day undermine the very foundations of the Republic. In the immediate aftermath of 146 BCE, the Roman Senate declared Carthage officially extinct. Its territory was absorbed into the new province of Africa, its surviving citizens, those not slaughtered or enslaved, scattered across the Mediterranean, their language banned from official use, their temples repurposed or razed, their records largely lost to time. The city itself was left in ruins, a desolate warning to any who might challenge Rome's supremacy. For decades, Romans avoided rebuilding it, adhering to an unspoken taboo. To restore Carthage would be to admit that the destruction had been a mistake, that the fear that drove Cato and his followers had been irrational, that the Republic had acted not from necessity, but from paranoia dressed in the robes of patriotism. Yet even as the stones of Carthage crumbled under desert winds, the ghost of its legacy haunted Roman politics. For generations, Roman orators had used Carthage as the ultimate foil, the embodiment of everything Rome was not: mercantile rather than martial, cunning rather than virtuous, Eastern in its sensibilities, corrupt in its worship, and above all, untrustworthy. Carthaginians, in Roman eyes, were oath breakers, child sacrificers, and lovers of gold over glory. This caricature had been essential during the Punic Wars, a tool to unify a fractious citizenry against a common enemy. But with that enemy gone, the narrative lost its anchor. Without Carthage, against whom would Rome define its virtue? Without an external threat, the internal fractures of Roman society, between patricians and plebeians, senators and generals, the urban poor and the landed elite, began to widen. Scipio Aemilianus, despite his role in Carthage's destruction, understood this better than most. He came from a lineage steeped in the old Republican ideals: duty, restraint, public service over personal ambition. He lived modestly, spoke with respect for Greek philosophy, and treated foreign captives with a dignity that many of his peers found excessive. And yet, he was also the man who gave the final order to burn Carthage. That contradiction weighed on him. In private conversations recorded by his friend Polybius, Scipio expressed deep misgivings about the precedent set by the total annihilation of a city that had surrendered, that had tried to live peacefully, that had not threatened Roman soil in over half a century. He feared that Rome, having tasted absolute power without consequence, would begin to see every problem as solvable by force alone. And he was right. Within a generation, Roman legions would march not just against foreign kings, but against fellow Romans. The Gracchi brothers would be murdered in the streets of Rome for daring to propose land reform that threatened the aristocracy. Generals like Marius and Sulla would turn their armies on the city itself, inaugurating an era of civil war that the Republic would never fully recover from. The disappearance of Carthage had removed the last external brake on Roman ambition, and without it, the Republic began to consume itself. But the story of regret did not end with Scipio's tears. It resurfaced decades later in the most unexpected place, in the Senate itself, during the reign of the dictator Julius Caesar. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, Rome was no longer the disciplined republic of Cincinnatus and Fabius Maximus. It was a sprawling empire, bloated with wealth, rife with corruption, and governed more by the whims of powerful individuals than by law. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, recognized that the province of Africa, once Carthaginian territory, was underutilized. The land was fertile, the ports strategic, and the memory of Carthage, though suppressed, still carried economic weight across the Mediterranean. In 44 BCE, just before his assassination, Caesar announced a bold plan. He would rebuild Carthage, not as a rival, but as a Roman colony, a symbol of renewal, a breadbasket for the empire, and a home for thousands of landless Roman citizens. The proposal shocked traditionalists. To rebuild the city Rome had sworn to erase seemed like sacrilege, a betrayal of Cato's dying words. Yet Caesar understood something deeper, that Rome's strength did not lie in perpetual vengeance, but in its ability to absorb, transform, and repurpose the cultures it conquered. He saw Carthage not as a threat, but as an asset waiting to be reclaimed. Though Caesar would never live to see it, his adopted heir Augustus carried out the plan. In 29 BCE, just a few years after defeating Antony and Cleopatra and declaring the end of the Republic, Augustus founded Colonia Iulia Concordia Carthago, a new city rising from the ashes of the old. Temples to Roman gods now stood where shrines to Baal once stood. Latin replaced Punic in the marketplace. But the spirit of Carthage, the mercantile energy, the maritime expertise, the cosmopolitan openness, seeped back into the empire. Within a century, Roman Carthage became one of the wealthiest cities in the Western Empire, second only to Rome itself in population and influence. The irony was profound. The city Rome had destroyed for being too successful was now thriving again under Roman rule, precisely because of the same qualities that had once made it feared. And in that revival, one could detect a quiet admission, a historical mea culpa, that the total destruction of Carthage had been not only unnecessary but counterproductive. Yet the regret ran even deeper than politics or economics. It touched the moral core of Roman identity. Roman historians, even those fiercely loyal to the state, could not ignore the brutality of 146 BCE. Sallust, writing just a few decades later, contrasted the early republic, frugal, just, and united, with the decadent, bloodthirsty empire it had become, and he pointed to the Punic Wars as the turning point. Livy, though he celebrated Roman victories, lingered on the tragic dignity of Carthaginian resistance, especially in his portrayal of Hasdrubal's wife, who, rather than surrender to Scipio, threw herself and her children into the flames of the besieged temple, a moment of defiant honor that many Romans found uncomfortably admirable. Even Virgil in the Aeneid, Rome's national epic, wove a subtle lament into his verses. When Aeneas visits Carthage in Book I, he finds it vibrant, beautiful, and ruled by the noble Queen Dido. Their doomed love affair is not just a romantic tragedy, it is a symbolic foreshadowing of the real-world conflict to come. Virgil, writing under Augustus, knew that his audience would read Dido's curse. Let there be no love between our peoples, ever, as a poetic echo of the hatred that would culminate in Carthage's destruction. But he also showed Dido as wise, just, and wronged, a mirror to Rome's future excesses. In giving her dignity, Virgil hinted at a truth many Romans whispered in private, that in destroying Carthage they had lost a part of their own soul. The Republic had once prided itself on clementia, mercy, and victory. After Cannae, Hannibal had released Roman prisoners without ransom, hoping to encourage negotiation. Rome refused, but the gesture was remembered. In contrast, Rome offered Carthage no mercy in 146. No negotiation, no quarter, total erasure. And in that act, many began to sense Rome had abandoned the very virtues that had made it great. The historian Tacitus, writing under the emperors, would later articulate this fear with chilling clarity. They make a desert and call it peace. The phrase was originally spoken by the Caledonian chieftain Calgacus, but it captured the essence of Roman imperialism at its worst, the belief that security could be bought through annihilation. Carthage became the first and most haunting example of that doctrine. Even in the centuries after the empire's fall, the memory of Carthage's destruction served as a cautionary tale. Early Christian writers, particularly Tertullian and Augustine, both of whom were born in Roman Carthage, grappled with the moral weight of their city's past. Augustine, in his monumental City of God, written after the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE, used the fall of both Rome and Carthage to argue that no earthly city, no matter how powerful, could claim eternal security. For Augustine, Carthage's fate was not divine punishment for paganism. After all, Christian Rome had fallen too, but a reminder of the transience of human glory. Yet it is telling that he chose to write his greatest work in a city that Rome had once tried to erase. That Carthage could rise again, not as a Punic power, but as a center of Christian thought, was itself a form of historical redemption. The land that Cato demanded be salted now bore fruit for a new civilization. And in that, perhaps, lies the final twist of the story, that Rome's attempt to eliminate Carthage forever ultimately failed, not because the city was rebuilt in brick and mortar, but because its memory could not be extinguished. The fear that drove Rome to destroy Carthage outlived the act itself. It became a parable about the dangers of unchecked power, the illusion of absolute security, and the tragic cost of letting hatred override reason. Even today, when historians speak of Punic faith, Fides Punica as a byword for treachery, they often fail to note that the phrase was Roman propaganda, designed to justify a war of extermination. The real lesson of Carthage is not that it was untrustworthy, but that Rome, in its fear, became the very thing it claimed to despise, ruthless, deceitful, and consumed by the need to dominate. And when Scipio wept on that hillside, he was not mourning Carthage alone, he was mourning Rome's future. Indeed, the tragedy of Carthage was not only in its physical obliteration, but in the way its erasure became a mirror reflecting Rome's slow moral unraveling, a process so gradual that few at the time recognized it for what it truly was, a transformation from a republic that prided itself on law, duty, and measured justice into an empire sustained by raw power, spectacle, and the illusion of permanence. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE did not happen in isolation. It was both a symptom and a catalyst of a profound shift within Roman political culture, a moment when the old mechanisms of restraint, senatorial debate, religious omens, the memory of ancestral custom, began to yield to expediency, ambition, and the intoxicating belief that Rome stood beyond the reach of fate. For generations, Rome had operated under a paradox. It expanded relentlessly, absorbing peoples and territories across the Mediterranean, yet it maintained a self-image as a reluctant conqueror, one that acted not out of greed but in defense of its allies or in response to genuine threats. Carthage had once fit neatly into this narrative, first as a rival in Sicily, then as the architect of Hannibal's invasion, a mortal danger that justified extraordinary measures. But by the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage posed no such threat. It had no navy to speak of, no overseas colonies, no alliances with hostile powers. Its wealth was agricultural, not military, its ambitions commercial, not territorial. And yet, the Roman Senate, swayed by the relentless drumbeat of Cato the Elder and his ideological heirs, manufactured a crisis where none existed, twisting Carthage's very act of self-preservation, its defense against Numidian incursions backed by Rome, into a violation worthy of annihilation. This was not defense. It was preemptive elimination disguised as legal necessity. And in embracing that logic, Rome crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Future generations would apply the same template again and again. Jugurtha in Numidia, Mithridates in Pontus, the Gauls under Vercingetorix, all would be painted as existential threats, their destruction framed as righteous, even inevitable, regardless of the actual balance of power. The precedent set at Carthage normalized total war against civilian populations, the razing of cities not for strategic gain but for symbolic dominance, and the notion that mercy was weakness rather than strength. Scipio Aemilianus, though he carried out the Senate's will, understood the cost of this new ethos. He saw that Rome, having vanquished its last worthy adversary, would turn inward, and that without an external challenge to unify it, the Republic would fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. His fears were realized with frightening speed. Within 50 years of Carthage's fall, Roman blood would flow in the streets of Rome itself during the conflicts between Marius and Sulla, the first of many civil wars that would hollow out the Republic from within. The legions, once loyal to the Senate and people of Rome, began to swear allegiance to individual generals who promised land, loot, and glory, commodities that the Republic, in its post-Carthaginian complacency, could no longer reliably provide. The wealth extracted from conquered provinces, including the fertile fields of former Carthaginian Africa, flooded into the city, enriching a small aristocratic class while the urban poor grew ever more desperate, ever more susceptible to demagogues who promised redistribution at the point of a sword. The old Roman virtues of frugality, discipline, and civic duty, the very qualities that had enabled Rome to survive Hannibal's onslaught, were increasingly relics of a bygone age, replaced by a culture of spectacle, extravagance, and performative cruelty. The games in the Forum, once modest religious observances, ballooned into grotesque displays of mass slaughter, where thousands of prisoners, slaves, and animals died for public amusement. And always in the background lingered the memory of Carthage, not as a warning, but as a trophy, proof that Rome could do anything, answerable to no one, bound by no law but its own will. Yet the regret was not confined to elite circles or philosophical musings. It seeped into the very language of Roman law and governance. The legal justification for Carthage's destruction rested on the claim that the city had violated its treaty by waging war without Roman consent. But this interpretation was dubious at best. Carthage had not declared war on Rome. It had defended its borders against Massinissa, the Numidian king, who was a Roman ally but also a persistent aggressor who seized Carthaginian territory with impunity, knowing Rome would not intervene. The Carthaginian Senate, desperate to avoid conflict, had repeatedly petitioned Rome for restraint, only to be ignored or dismissed. When they finally armed themselves to repel Massinissa's raids, they did so not as an act of aggression but as an act of survival, a right any sovereign people might claim. Rome, however, treated this as casus belli, not because the act itself was egregious, but because it demonstrated that Carthage still possessed the capacity for independent action. That was the true crime: autonomy. In the post-Hannibalic world, Rome demanded not just submission, but total political infantilization. A Carthage that could think for itself, even in self-defense, was intolerable. This precedent would haunt Rome's dealings with other client states for centuries. Kingdoms like Pergamum or Judea learned the hard way that loyalty and peace were not enough. One had to appear powerless, grateful, and perpetually deferential. Any sign of initiative, any hint of self-reliance could be interpreted as rebellion. The destruction of Carthage thus established a toxic template for imperial management. Not partnership but domination, not trust but suspicion, not mutual benefit but extraction. And as the empire grew, this model proved increasingly unsustainable. Governing distant provinces through fear alone required ever larger armies, ever harsher governors, and ever greater expenditures, costs that strained the treasury and bred resentment among subject peoples. The very mechanisms that had ensured Carthage's destruction would, in time, undermine the stability of the empire itself. Rebellions flared in Spain, in Gaul, in Egypt, each brutally suppressed, each leaving behind a legacy of bitterness that no triumphal arch or senatorial decree could erase. The Roman historian Florus, writing in the 2nd century CE, would look back on the Punic Wars and describe them as the moment Rome began to grow old, not in years, but in spirit, the point at which victory ceased to ennoble and instead began to corrupt. Even the land itself seemed to remember. Long after the last Punic temple had been dismantled and the last Carthaginian name faded from public record, farmers in the region reported strange phenomena. Ghostly lights near the ruins, the sound of weeping in the wind, the refusal of certain crops to grow in the shadow of Biasa Hill. These were not mere superstitions. They were expressions of a collective unease, a sense that the earth had absorbed the violence of 146 BCE and would not let it rest. Roman settlers, sent to farm the newly confiscated lands, often avoided the precise center of the old city, building their villas on the periphery as if afraid to tread too closely on the bones of the past. Centuries later, when Augustus ordered the refoundation of Carthage, the architects and engineers reportedly performed elaborate purification rites before laying the first stone of the new forum, as though seeking absolution from the spirits of those who had died there. And perhaps they were right to do so, for the rebuilt Carthage, though Roman in name and structure, never quite lost its Punic soul. The local dialect of Latin spoken in Africa retained traces of Punic vocabulary. The agricultural techniques, especially in olive cultivation and irrigation, were inherited from Carthaginian methods described centuries earlier by the Carthaginian writer Mago, whose 28-volume treatise on farming had been so valued by the Romans that the Senate ordered it translated into Latin after the Second Punic War. Even the layout of the new city, with its emphasis on harbor access and market squares, echoed the priorities of its predecessor. In this subtle continuity, one could detect a quiet form of historical justice, that the knowledge, resilience, and ingenuity that Rome had tried to extinguish proved too deeply rooted in the land to be fully eradicated. Carthage, in a sense, outlived its destroyer, not through arms, but through memory, adaptation, and the enduring power of place. And in that survival lay the ultimate refutation of Cato's dogma. Carthage did not need to be destroyed to cease being a threat. It needed only to be given the chance to evolve. Rome's failure to see that was not merely a strategic error. It was a failure of imagination, of empathy, of the very wisdom that great powers require to endure. The haunting legacy of Carthage did not simply fade with the passage of centuries or the transformation of the Mediterranean world under Roman rule. Rather, it seeped into the very architecture of imperial consciousness, becoming an unspoken but ever-present reference point whenever Rome confronted the limits of its own power or the fragility of its moral authority. Long after the last Punic speaker had vanished and the written records of Carthaginian history had crumbled into dust, preserved only through the biased lens of Roman and Greek chroniclers, The question of whether Rome had gone too far in 146 BCE continued to echo in the corridors of power, in the private letters of statesmen, and in the philosophical debates of scholars who dared to question the righteousness of empire. Even as the Caesars proclaimed peace across the known world, even as marble temples and aqueducts rose from the ashes of older civilizations, the ghost of Carthage lingered as a reminder that no victory is absolute if it is bought with the currency of total destruction. For what Rome failed to grasp in its moment of supreme triumph was that empires do not fall because of external enemies alone. They falter when they lose the capacity for self-correction, when they mistake cruelty for strength and silence for security. The annihilation of Carthage was not merely the end of a rival city-state. It was the moment Rome began to believe its own propaganda so thoroughly that it could no longer distinguish between justice and vengeance, between necessity and obsession. And that delusion, once embedded in the logic of statecraft, would prove far more dangerous than any army Hannibal ever led across the Alps. The Senate that cheered Cato's mantra of Carthago delenda est may have believed they were safeguarding Rome's future, but in truth, they were setting a precedent that would poison the wellspring of Roman political life for generations to come. Once the idea took root that an entire people could be deemed unworthy of existence, that a city could be unmade not for what it had done, but for what it might one day become, the Republic surrendered its claim to moral exceptionalism. From that point forward, every conquest, every suppression, every act of collective punishment could be justified by invoking the shadow of Carthage, not as it truly was, but as Rome needed it to be, a cautionary fable of perfidy and divine retribution. This myth-making served a purpose in its time, binding Romans together through a shared narrative of survival against an existential evil. But myths, when mistaken for history, distort reality in ways that ultimately weaken the societies that cling to them. The real Carthage, the cosmopolitan hub of trade, the innovator in maritime law, the synthesizer of Phoenician, Berber, and Hellenistic cultures, was far more complex than the caricature Rome constructed to justify its eradication. But by erasing the city so completely, Rome also erased the possibility of reconciliation, of learning from its former adversary, of transforming a centuries-long rivalry into a partnership that might have tempered Roman arrogance with Carthaginian pragmatism. Instead, Rome chose isolation through supremacy, and in doing so, it condemned itself to repeat the same errors on an ever larger scale, confronting every new challenge with the same blunt instrument of force that had worked, or so it seemed, against Carthage. This pattern became painfully evident in the decades that followed, as Rome turned its legions eastward and encountered civilizations far older, more sophisticated, and less easily defined as barbarian than the Carthaginians had been. In Greece, in Egypt, in Parthia, Rome found itself entangled in conflicts where military superiority did not translate into lasting control, where the hearts and minds of subject peoples could not be won through fear alone, and where the moral ambiguity of conquest became impossible to ignore. The philosopher Seneca, tutor to Emperor Nero and a man acutely aware of the contradictions within Roman imperialism, wrote with biting irony about the hypocrisy of a state that claimed to bring civilization to the world while burning cities and enslaving entire populations. He asked whether it was truly civilized to call those you plundered savages, and whether the laurels worn by triumphant generals were stained with the blood of innocents, whose only crime was to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though Seneca never named Carthage directly, perhaps out of caution or decorum, his critique resonated with the unspoken guilt that many educated Romans felt about the city's fate. Even the poet Lucan, in his epic Pharsalia, which chronicled the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, lamented that Rome's greatest tragedy was not that it had enemies, but that it had none left worthy of its steel. "We have conquered the world," his verses intoned, "and now we turn our swords on ourselves." This sentiment, though expressed in the context of civil strife, traced its roots back to the post-Carthaginian era, when Rome's external challenges diminished and its internal divisions metastasized. Without a Carthage to fear, Roman ambition had no external outlet, and so it turned inward, feeding on itself in an endless cycle of purges, proscriptions, and power struggles that would eventually consume the Republic and give birth to the autocracy of the emperors. Augustus, the first emperor, understood this dynamic better than most. He cloaked his rule in the language of restoration, of returning Rome to its ancestral virtues, but beneath the rhetoric lay a cold recognition that the old system could not be revived. The Republic had died not on the Ides of March with Caesar, but decades earlier, on the smoldering ruins of Carthage, where the last vestiges of Roman restraint had been sacrificed on the altar of absolute security. Augustus's decision to rebuild Carthage was thus not merely an economic or demographic calculation. It was a symbolic act of atonement, an acknowledgement that the erasure of a civilization, even an enemy civilization, was a wound that would not heal until the land itself was allowed to speak again. By founding a Roman colony on the site of the old Punic capital, Augustus sought to reconcile past and present, to weave the memory of Carthage into the fabric of empire rather than pretend it had never existed. And in doing so, he inadvertently confirmed what Scipio Aemilianus had sensed centuries before, that Rome's greatness depended not on the absence of rivals, but on its ability to absorb, transform, and learn from them. This truth would be tested again and again in the centuries that followed, as the Roman Empire faced new crises that could not be solved by legions alone, plagues that ignored borders, economic stagnation that no amount of tribute could reverse, and a spiritual hunger that the old gods could not satisfy. In the 3rd century CE, when the empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil war, barbarian invasions, and hyperinflation, the provinces of North Africa, centered once more around the thriving city of Roman Carthage, became one of the few stable, prosperous regions holding the imperial system together. The grain shipments from Africa fed Rome when Gaul and Spain were in chaos. The taxes from its cities funded armies that fought on the Danube and the Euphrates, and its intellectual life produced some of the most original Christian thinkers of the age. Tertullian, the fiery theologian who coined the phrase, "the blood of the martyrs," is the seed of the church, wrote in Latin, but thought in the cultural rhythms of Punic Africa, blending Roman legal precision with a moral intensity that owed as much to Carthaginian religious fervor as to Christian doctrine. Later, Cyprian, bishop of Carthage and martyr under Valerian, would model ecclesiastical leadership on the civic responsibility once expected of Punic elders, emphasizing unity, discipline, and care for the poor in ways that contrasted sharply with the decadence of late imperial Rome. And finally, Augustine of Hippo, born just south of Carthage in 354 CE, would synthesize the entire Greco-Roman philosophical tradition with Christian theology to produce a vision of history so profound that it would shape Western thought for over a millennium. In his City of God, written in the wake of the Visigothic sack of Rome in 410 CE, Augustine dismantled the pagan argument that Rome's fall was due to its abandonment of the old gods, arguing instead that all earthly cities, no matter how mighty, are transient by nature. Rome, like Babylon, like Troy, like Carthage, was destined to rise and fall according to the inscrutable will of divine providence. But in making this argument, Augustine did something remarkable. He placed Carthage and Rome on equal footing in the grand narrative of human impermanence. For him, neither city was uniquely blessed or cursed. Both were part of the same tragic, beautiful, and fleeting human story. That a man born in the very land Rome had sought to sterilize could become one of its most influential spiritual heirs was perhaps the ultimate irony and the ultimate vindication of Carthage's enduring legacy. The Punic spirit, though suppressed, had not been extinguished. It had merely waited, patient and resilient, for the moment when Rome itself would need wisdom more than weapons, reflection more than conquest. In the end, Carthage did not return with armies or navies. It returned through ideas, through faith, through the quiet persistence of memory that no amount of fire could erase. And in that return, Rome, now Christian, now crumbling, now humbled, found not a ghost of its past enemy, but a mirror for its own soul. The story of Carthage and Rome, when examined not as a simple chronicle of battles and treaties, but as a profound meditation on the nature of power, memory, and moral consequence, reveals a truth that resonates far beyond the ancient Mediterranean, that the greatest danger an empire faces is not the strength of its enemies, but the corrosion of its own principles in the name of security. Rome did not destroy Carthage because it had to. It destroyed Carthage because it could, and in that act of absolute dominion, it sowed the seeds of its own spiritual and political decay. For centuries, Roman historians and orators had portrayed the Punic Wars as a necessary struggle for survival, a righteous crusade against a cunning and untrustworthy foe whose very existence threatened the stability of the civilized world. Yet even in antiquity, there were those who whispered otherwise, those who recognized that the Carthage of the Third Punic War was not the Carthage of Hannibal, that it had laid down its arms, embraced peace, and sought only to rebuild its shattered economy through trade and agriculture, not conquest. The Roman Senate of 149 BCE knew this. They had access to reports from envoys, to intelligence from merchants, to the observations of provincial governors in Sicily and Spain who dealt regularly with Carthaginian traders. They knew that Carthage posed no military threat. What they feared was not Carthage's army, because it no longer had one, but Carthage's potential, its capacity to recover, its ability to thrive without Rome's permission. In a world increasingly dominated by Roman fiat, the very existence of a prosperous, independent-minded city on the African coast was an affront to the emerging ideology of universal Roman supremacy. To allow Carthage to flourish, even peacefully, was to admit that Rome's victory in the Second Punic War had not been total, that the Republic's authority was not absolute, and that other paths to greatness might still exist beyond the shadow of the eagle. And so, the decision to destroy Carthage was not born of strategy, but of ideology, a belief that the only safe rival is a non-existent one. This logic, once enshrined as policy, became a self-perpetuating cycle. Each subsequent act of annihilation, whether against Corinth in the same year, against Numantia in Spain decades later, or against Jerusalem in 70 CE, was justified by invoking the precedent of Carthage. Remember Carthage, senators would say, as if the city's name alone was sufficient to silence dissent. But what they were really saying was, remember that mercy is dangerous. Remember that forgiveness is weakness. Remember that total control is the only true peace. And in repeating this mantra, Rome gradually abandoned the very qualities that had made it resilient in its earlier centuries: flexibility, pragmatism, a willingness to incorporate former enemies into the body politic as allies, citizens, even senators. The early republic had survived by absorbing its neighbors, granting them rights, intermarrying with their elites, and allowing local customs to persist beneath a Roman administrative framework. But the post-Carthaginian Empire, intoxicated by its own invincibility, increasingly saw difference not as an asset but as a threat, and autonomy not as a sign of health but as a symptom of rebellion. This shift was not merely administrative, it was psychological, cultural, and ultimately existential. A society that defines itself solely in opposition to an enemy must either find new enemies forever or collapse into internal conflict when none remain. Rome chose both paths, and the result was a slow, centuries-long unraveling that no wall, no legion, no emperor could ultimately prevent. Even the physical landscape of North Africa bore witness to this paradox. After the destruction of Carthage, Roman settlers initially avoided the Acropolis of Baissa, the sacred hill where the final defenders had made their last stand. Legends persisted that the ground was cursed, that the spirits of the dead would not rest, that crops planted too close to the ruins would wither or yield bitter fruit. Archaeological evidence from the late Republican period shows that the area remained largely undeveloped for nearly a century, used only for grazing or as a quarry for building materials shipped to other provinces. It was not until the reign of Augustus, more than 100 years after the city's fall, that systematic reconstruction began. And even then, the new Roman Carthage was built with a certain deference to the past. The main forum was laid out not directly over the old Punic temples, but adjacent to them, as if to acknowledge their former presence without erasing it entirely. The amphitheater, the baths, the aqueducts, all were constructed using local limestone and traditional North African engineering techniques that had been refined under Carthaginian rule. Roman colonists, though they spoke Latin and worshipped Jupiter Optimus Maximus, quickly adopted Punic agricultural practices, especially the cultivation of olives and the production of garum, the fermented fish sauce that was a staple of Mediterranean cuisine and a major export from the region. The very soil, enriched by centuries of Carthaginian terracing and irrigation, proved so fertile that Roman Carthage soon became the breadbasket of the Western Empire, supplying grain not only to Rome, but to legions stationed as far away as Britain. In this quiet fusion of cultures, one could detect a historical reconciliation that the Senate of 146 BCE had deemed impossible. The Carthaginian legacy, though officially suppressed, had not been extinguished. It had merely gone underground, surviving in the rhythms of daily life, in the layout of fields, in the cadence of speech, in the names of rivers and hills that no Roman decree could rename. And when, in the 2nd century CE, the great orator Fronto of Emesa, tutor to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, praised the eloquence of African Latin, he was unknowingly celebrating a linguistic tradition shaped as much by Punic syntax as by Cicero's prose. The province of Africa, once the site of Rome's most ruthless act of erasure, became one of its most intellectually vibrant regions, producing not only Christian theologians like Tertullian and Augustine, but also jurists, poets, and philosophers who helped define the cultural identity of the High Empire. This was not a coincidence. It was a testament to the resilience of place, to the enduring power of a civilization that, even in death, continued to shape the world that had tried to forget it. And yet, the moral reckoning remained incomplete. For all its prosperity, Roman Carthage never fully escaped the shadow of its violent birth. The memory of 146 BCE lingered in the collective consciousness, not as a warning to be heeded, but as a precedent to be avoided repeating, yet rarely was it questioned at its root. Roman historians, even those critical of imperial excess like Tacitus or Sallust, tended to frame the destruction of Carthage as a tragic necessity rather than a moral failure. They lamented the loss of Roman virtue, but they rarely extended empathy to the Carthaginians themselves, whose voices had been silenced so thoroughly that they could not speak even in the annals of their conquerors. The only surviving fragments of Carthaginian perspective come through hostile intermediaries, Polybius, who admired Scipio but dismissed Carthaginian politics as corrupt, Livy, who portrayed Hannibal as a brilliant but godless monster, Diodorus Siculus, who described Carthaginian child sacrifice with sensational horror, though modern archaeology suggests such practices, if they existed at all, were rare and confined to extreme crisis periods. The true Carthage, the city of merchants who navigated by the stars, of engineers who built artificial harbors capable of sheltering hundreds of ships, of diplomats who negotiated treaties in 3 languages, was lost to history, replaced by a caricature designed to justify its erasure. This erasure was not merely physical, it was epistemological. By destroying Carthage's archives, its temples, its schools, Rome ensured that the only story that would survive was its own. And in controlling the narrative, it controlled the lesson. Future generations would learn that Carthage fell because it was deceitful, not because Rome feared its resilience. That Rome triumphed because it was virtuous, not because it was relentless. This distortion served the empire well in its prime, but it became a liability in its decline. When barbarian tribes began to press against the frontiers in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Roman leaders responded with the same logic that had doomed Carthage. Total war, total subjugation, no compromise. They failed to see that many of these groups, Goths, Vandals, even the early Franks, were not inherently hostile but were seeking inclusion, not destruction. Had Rome remembered the true lesson of Carthage, that strength lies not in annihilation but in integration, it might have transformed these newcomers into allies, as it had once done with the Samnites, the Etruscans, and even the Gauls of northern Italy. Instead, it treated them as existential threats, pushing them into rebellion and ultimately into the arms of rival powers. The Vandals, who would famously sack Rome in 455 CE, had originally sought settlement within the empire as foederati, treaty allies, but were rebuffed, betrayed, and driven to desperation. When they finally crossed into North Africa and captured Carthage in 439 CE, they did not destroy it. They made it their capital. And for nearly a century, Carthage once again became a center of Mediterranean power, not as a Punic city, not as a Roman one, but as a Vandal kingdom that blended Germanic, Roman, and African traditions in a new synthesis. The irony was exquisite. The city Rome had erased to prevent the rise of a rival was reborn as the seat of a new power that would humiliate Rome itself. And when the Byzantine general Belisarius recaptured Carthage in 533 CE on behalf of Emperor Justinian, he found a city still standing, still functioning, still bearing the layered marks of its many lives: Punic, Roman, Vandal, Christian. Justinian's engineers restored the aqueducts, his clergy built new basilicas over old temples, and his administrators reinstated Roman law. But the ghost of 146 BCE could not be exorcised. The final destruction of Carthage would not come from an empire, but from time itself, and from the Arab conquests of the 7th century, which brought not ruin, but transformation. As the city faded into the Islamic world, its stones reused, its name softened into Cartagena, its memory preserved not in Latin chronicles, but in Arabic poetry and Berber oral tradition. The year 146 before the Common Era did not merely mark the end of a city. It marked the moment when the Roman Republic, in its relentless pursuit of absolute security, crossed a threshold from measured statecraft into the realm of mythic vengeance, enacting a punishment so total that it defied the very customs of war that even Rome's harshest ancestors had observed. In earlier conflicts, Rome had often shown clemency to defeated foes, granting citizenship to surrendered tribes, restoring kings who pledged loyalty, allowing conquered cities to retain their laws and local governance so long as they acknowledged Roman supremacy. After the defeat of Pyrrhus in the 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome permitted the Greek cities of southern Italy to keep their autonomy. After the subjugation of Macedon, it initially ruled through client kings rather than direct annexation. Even after the catastrophic victories of Hannibal during the Second Punic War, when Roman casualties numbered in the tens of thousands and the very survival of the Republic hung in the balance, Rome did not demand the eradication of Carthage. Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal at Zama in the year 202 before the Common Era, imposed harsh terms: disarmament, loss of overseas territories, a massive indemnity. But he deliberately left Carthage intact, sovereign in name if not in military power, because he understood that a humbled but functioning Carthage served Rome's long-term interests better than a vacuum of power in North Africa. His wisdom, however, was not inherited by his successors. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, a new generation of Roman senators had come to power, men who had never seen war, who had not lived through the terror of Hannibal's march through Italy, who knew Carthage only as a name in history books and a symbol in political rhetoric. For them, Carthage was not a real place inhabited by real people, but an abstraction, a ghost to be exorcised, a lingering doubt in the narrative of Roman invincibility. Cato the Elder, though old enough to remember the fear of Hannibal, weaponized that memory not to caution against hubris, but to stoke paranoia. In every speech he delivered on any subject, grain prices, judicial reform, temple maintenance, he concluded with the same phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. He did this not because Carthage was actively threatening Rome, but because the idea of Carthage's continued existence undermined the illusion that Rome's victory had been final and irreversible. To Cato and his followers, peace was not the absence of war, but the absence of potential rivals. And so, when Carthage, after decades of compliance, finally raised a militia to defend its borders against the relentless encroachments of King Massinissa of Numidia, a Roman ally who acted with impunity precisely because Rome encouraged him, the Senate seized upon this as proof of Carthaginian perfidy. Never mind that Carthage had sought Roman mediation repeatedly and been ignored. Never mind that the treaty forbidding Carthage from waging war without Roman consent had been interpreted by Carthage as applying to offensive wars, not defensive ones. Never mind that Massinissa's raids had reduced entire Carthaginian towns to ash. To the Senate, the mere act of self-defense was rebellion. And rebellion, in the new logic of post-Hannibalic Rome, demanded not correction, but annihilation. The siege that followed was not a military necessity but a ritual of purification. For 3 long years, from the year 149 before the Common Era to the spring of 146 before the Common Era, Roman legions encircled Carthage, not merely to subdue it but to break its spirit. When the Carthaginians surrendered their weapons, over 200,000 sets of arms, according to ancient accounts, they believed the crisis was over. They expected, as other defeated cities had, to be punished but spared. Instead, the Roman commander Lucius Marcius Censorinus demanded something far more humiliating: that the entire population abandon the city and relocate at least 10 miles inland, effectively turning Carthage from a maritime capital into a landlocked village severed from its economic lifeline. This was not a reasonable demand. It was a death sentence disguised as policy. Carthage's wealth, its identity, its very reason for existing was tied to the sea. To move inland was to cease being Carthaginian, and so, in an act of desperate courage, the people of Carthage chose resistance over erasure. They melted down sacred statues to forge new swords. They tore apart temple roofs to build shields. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Children carried stones to the walls. For months, they held off the Roman legions with nothing but ingenuity and will. When the Romans finally breached the walls, the fighting did not end in the streets. It descended into the sewers, the granaries, the stairwells of multi-story houses. The final stand took place in the Temple of Eshmun, where the last defenders, led by a general named Hasdrubal, fought until fire consumed them all, except for Hasdrubal himself, who surrendered. His wife, watching from a window above, cursed him for his cowardice, then threw their children into the flames before leaping in after them. Scipio Aemilianus, who had taken command after earlier Roman generals failed, watched this scene from a distance. He was not a man given to sentimentality, yet ancient sources agree that he wept. He wept not because he regretted the victory. Duty bound him to complete the Senate's order, but because he foresaw what others could not, that in destroying Carthage, Rome had destroyed a part of itself. He knew that a republic without rivals grows complacent. A people without fear of loss grow arrogant. A state without external checks on its power becomes a tyranny unto itself. And as the smoke rose over the ruins, he reportedly quoted the lines from Homer, Iliad, that foretell the fall of Troy. The day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain. Then he turned to his Greek friend and historian Polybius and asked, in a voice heavy with dread, "Do you suppose that someday the same fate may befall my own country?" Polybius, stunned into silence, could offer no answer, but history would. Within a century, Roman blood would flow in the Forum. Within 2, the Republic would be dead. Within 3, emperors would rule as gods. And the virtues that had once defined Rome, duty, discipline, mercy, and victory, would be relics spoken of only in schools and inscriptions, not practiced in the halls of power. The destruction of Carthage in the year 146 before the Common Era was not merely a military campaign concluded with fire and enslavement. It was the inauguration of a new moral order within the Roman world, one in which the boundaries between justice and vengeance, between strategic necessity and ideological purification, became so blurred that they eventually vanished altogether. In the decades that followed, the precedent set by Carthage's annihilation would be invoked not only to justify further acts of total war, but to redefine what it meant to be Roman at all. Where once Roman identity had been rooted in law, in the idea of civitas, the shared rights and responsibilities of citizenship, now it became increasingly tied to the spectacle of absolute dominance, to the performance of power for its own sake. Triumphs in Rome grew more extravagant, more detached from actual battlefield achievement, turning into theatrical displays of imperial omnipotence rather than celebrations of republican virtue. Generals who had never faced a worthy foe paraded chains of unarmed captives through the streets, not because those people had threatened Rome, but because their subjugation demonstrated that no corner of the known world lay beyond Roman reach. This shift was not accidental, it was systemic. The psychological architecture of empire demands enemies, not merely to conquer, but to define itself against. With Carthage gone, Rome manufactured new adversaries, sometimes out of whole cloth, because the political machinery of the late Republic had become dependent on perpetual conflict to maintain cohesion, to reward loyalty, and to distribute the spoils of conquest among an ever-hungrier elite. The legions, once citizen soldiers who returned to their farms after campaigns, now expected land, wealth, and political influence as their due. Without new territories to plunder, without new populations to enslave, the Roman state could not satisfy the demands of its own military class. Thus, the logic that had doomed Carthage, that peace without total control was dangerous, became the engine of endless expansion, even when expansion no longer served the public good. The Senate debated not whether to go to war, but where and against whom, and how the resulting chaos might be turned to advantage by one faction or another. In this environment, the memory of Carthage was not mourned, it was weaponized. It became a rhetorical cudgel used to silence moderation. Any senator who advocated negotiation, who urged restraint, who suggested that a defeated people might be more valuable as allies than as ashes, was accused of forgetting Carthage, of being soft, naive, or worse, unpatriotic. The phrase, "remember Carthage," ceased to be a historical reference and became a dog whistle for uncompromising destruction, a way to equate diplomacy with betrayal and mercy with weakness. And yet, beneath the surface of this hardened ideology, unease persisted. It surfaced in the writings of philosophers like Panidius, who taught Scipio Aemilianus, and whose Stoic ethics emphasized justice, equity, and the brotherhood of humankind, even among enemies. It appeared in the private correspondence of statesmen like Cicero, who, though he never questioned Rome's right to rule, often lamented the coarsening of public life and the loss of the old republican spirit. It echoed in the plays of Terence, himself a North African of Punic or Berber origin, whose comedies subtly championed human dignity regardless of origin, reminding Roman audiences that virtue was not the monopoly of any one people. But these voices, though respected, were increasingly marginalized in a culture that valued strength over wisdom, spectacle over substance, and victory over virtue. The land of Carthage itself, meanwhile, became a paradox, a place of both desolation and fertility, of memory and erasure, of Roman triumph and unspoken remorse. For nearly a century after the city's fall, the site remained officially uninhabited, not because the soil was barren, but because the Senate had decreed it so, enshrining the destruction as sacred policy. Yet farmers from the surrounding countryside still worked the fields, still harvested olives and grain from lands once owned by Carthaginian nobles, still whispered stories of the great harbor that had once sheltered 1,000 ships. These stories were not written down. They were passed orally, in the rhythms of plowing and harvest, in lullabies sung in a hybrid tongue that mixed Punic roots with Latin inflections. The Roman state could erase temples and archives, but it could not erase the relationship between a people and their land. And so, when Julius Caesar, in the final years of his life, proposed the refoundation of Carthage as a Roman colony, he was not merely responding to economic pragmatism. Though the grain yields of Africa were indeed vital to feeding Rome's swelling population, he was also acknowledging, however indirectly, that the policy of total erasure had failed. A land that is cursed cannot feed an empire. A memory that is suppressed will find other ways to speak. Caesar understood that true power does not lie in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to transform, to absorb, to make former enemies into citizens, former rivals into partners. His plan was cut short by the daggers of the Ides of March, but his heir Augustus carried it forward with the quiet determination of a man who knew that the future of Rome depended not on clinging to the myths of the past, but on building a new order from the ruins of old hatreds. When Roman Carthage rose again in the year 29 before the Common Era, it was not a replica of the Punic city, nor was it a monument to Roman conquest alone. It was something new, a hybrid civilization, Roman in law and language, African in spirit and soil, Christian in its later centuries, and always unmistakably a testament to the futility of trying to erase a people completely. The streets followed Roman grids, but the water systems used Carthaginian cistern designs. The Forum displayed statues of emperors, but the local elite traced their ancestry, sometimes proudly, sometimes secretly, to Punic merchants and priests. Even the Christian churches that would later rise on the ruins of pagan temples were built with stones salvaged from both Roman and Punic structures, layering history upon history in a physical metaphor for reconciliation. And still, the question Scipio had asked on that hillside in 146, before the Common Era hung in the air like smoke that never fully dissipates, could Rome suffer the same fate? The answer, centuries later, would be yes. Not in the same manner, not with the same actors, but in the same spirit. Rome would not be burned by a single invader, but hollowed out from within by the very habits of thought that Carthage's destruction had normalized. The belief that power is permanent, that enemies must be eradicated rather than understood, that security can be achieved through fear alone. When the Visigoths entered Rome in the year 410 of the Common Era, they did not come as conquerors seeking to unmake the city. They came as disgruntled foederati, treaty allies, who had been denied the land and pay promised to them by a bankrupt and indifferent imperial administration. They looted, yes, but they did not burn. They spared churches, respected civilians, and left after 3 days. The real destruction had already happened long before in the Senate chambers, in the hearts of leaders who chose paranoia over prudence, in the collective decision to equate mercy with weakness. By the time Augustine of Hippo wrote his City of God in the aftermath of that sack, the lesson was clear. No earthly city, no matter how mighty, is immune to time, to error, to the consequences of its own choices. And in the province of Africa, where Augustine lived and taught, the memory of Carthage was not a distant legend but a living presence. He walked streets paved with stones that had once lain beneath Punic feet. He preached in basilicas built over temples that had once echoed with prayers to Tanit. He knew that civilizations do not die in a single day. They fade when they forget how to learn from their adversaries, when they mistake domination for wisdom, when they believe that victory over others is the same as virtue within. Carthage, in the end, did not need to return with armies to prove Rome wrong. It returned through the land itself, through the olive trees that still bore fruit, through the aqueducts that still carried water, through the quiet persistence of a people who, though their name was erased from official records, left an indelible mark on the soul of the empire that sought to destroy them. And in that return, in that silent endurance, lies the most profound judgment of all, that the true measure of a civilization is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies, and what it becomes after the enemy is gone. The enduring presence of Carthage within the very fabric of Roman Africa was not merely a matter of agricultural continuity or architectural recycling. It was a deep, almost cellular memory embedded in the landscape, in the language of the marketplace, in the cadence of prayer and song that persisted long after the last official utterance of the Punic tongue had vanished from public record. Even as Roman senators in distant Italy debated the merits of provincial taxation or the loyalty of frontier legions, the farmers of the Bagrada's river valley, the lifeblood of North African fertility, still planted their fields using techniques first perfected by Carthaginian agronomists centuries before the Common Era. They followed the lunar calendar not because Rome dictated it, but because their ancestors had done so, aligning sowing and harvest with celestial rhythms that predated both Roman law and Punic treaty. The olives they pressed, the wheat they stored, the wine they fermented, all bore the imprint of a civilization that had mastered the delicate balance between desert and sea, scarcity and abundance, isolation and trade. This was not passive survival, it was active inheritance. And though the Roman state never formally acknowledged it, the prosperity of imperial Africa, the very grain that fed the city of Rome for centuries, was built upon foundations laid by the very people Rome had sworn to erase. The irony was not lost on those who lived it. Roman governors posted to Africa often marveled at the efficiency of the local economy, the sophistication of the irrigation networks, the resilience of the population in the face of drought and locusts. They credited Roman engineering, Roman order, Roman discipline. But the truth was far more complex. The Roman aqueducts that snaked across the hills of Carthage were fed by springs first mapped by Punic surveyors. The granaries that held enough wheat to feed Rome for months were constructed on principles of ventilation and pest control described in the lost agricultural treatise of Mago. The Carthaginian writer, whose work the Roman Senate itself had ordered translated into Latin after the Second Punic War, recognizing even then that Carthaginian knowledge was worth preserving, even as Carthaginian sovereignty was not. This duality, admiration for Carthaginian skill, contempt for Carthaginian identity, became a hallmark of Roman imperial policy. Extract the utility, erase the source. But memory, like water, finds its way through stone. In the homes of North African elites, many of whom bore Roman names and held Roman citizenship, the walls were adorned with mosaics depicting Roman gods, yet the borders of those mosaics often featured motifs that scholars now recognize as Punic. The sign of Tanit, stylized into geometric patterns so subtle they could be mistaken for mere decoration. The palm tree, sacred to Baal Hammon, rendered as a neutral landscape element. The dolphin, symbol of maritime protection, recurring with a frequency that suggests ritual significance rather than artistic whim. These were not acts of rebellion, but acts of preservation, quiet assertions of identity in a world that demanded conformity. Even the Latin spoken in the province of Africa carried traces of its Punic substrate. Certain vowel pronunciations, syntactic structures that favored verb-final constructions, idioms that made little sense in Italian Latin, but resonated perfectly with Semitic linguistic patterns. When Tertullian, the fiery theologian of Carthage in the late 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote his apologetic works in Latin, his arguments pulsed with a moral absolutism and rhetorical intensity that owed as much to the prophetic traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean as to Roman legalism. He did not merely defend Christianity. He demanded purity, consistency, and uncompromising truth, values that echoed the stark dualisms of Punic religious thought, where loyalty to the gods was not a matter of ritual observance alone, but of total existential commitment. Later, when Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, organized relief for plague victims during the devastating epidemic of the mid-3rd century of the Common Era. He did so not as a Roman administrator, but as a spiritual leader in the mold of the old Punic civic priests, who had once overseen both religious rites and public welfare. His emphasis on communal responsibility, on the obligation of the wealthy to care for the poor, on the unity of the faithful as a single body. These were not innovations imported from Rome, but revivals of a communal ethic that had long defined Carthaginian urban life. And then there was Augustine, born in the town of Thagest in the year 354 of the Common Era, whose mind would become one of the great synthesizing forces of Western civilization. Though he wrote in flawless Latin, quoted Virgil with ease, and served as a professor of rhetoric in Milan, a heart of imperial Roman culture, his spiritual journey was deeply rooted in the soil of Africa. His early exposure to Manichaeism, his later struggle with sin and grace, his profound meditation on time, memory, and divine providence, all were shaped by a cultural environment that had long grappled with questions of divine justice, human frailty, and the tension between earthly order and eternal truth. When he penned his Confessions, the first true autobiography in Western literature, he did not merely recount his personal failings. He excavated the depths of human consciousness in a way that reflected a worldview far older than Rome, a worldview that saw the soul not as a passive subject of fate, but as an active participant in a cosmic drama of choice and consequence. And when he wrote City of God in the wake of Rome sacked by the Visigoths, he did not mourn the fall of an eternal city. He dismantled the very idea that any human institution could claim eternity. In doing so, he quietly placed Carthage and Rome on the same plane, not as enemies, but as fellow travelers on the road of history, both destined to rise, flourish, and fade according to the inscrutable will of God. This was not historical revisionism, it was theological realism. And it was possible only because Augustine stood on ground that had known both destruction and rebirth, both erasure and continuity. The ultimate vindication of Carthage, then, was not in its physical reconstruction under Augustus, nor in its economic revival under the High Empire, but in its spiritual and intellectual afterlife, a presence so woven into the texture of North African Roman life that it could not be excised, even by an empire that prided itself on total control. Rome had sought to make Carthage a warning, a desert where no rival would ever rise again. Instead, it became a cradle, one that nurtured not only grain and olive oil, but ideas that would outlive the empire itself. The very fact that some of the most profound challenges to Roman imperial ideology emerged from this land, Tertullian's critique of state violence, Cyprian's model of ecclesial unity over political loyalty, Augustine's vision of a heavenly city beyond the reach of earthly empires, suggests that the spirit of Carthage had not been extinguished, but transmuted. It had ceased to be a political entity and become a moral witness, and in that transformation, it achieved something far more enduring than military victory. It became a question that Rome, and all empires after it, would be forced to answer again and again. What is the cost of absolute power? What is lost when fear replaces wisdom? What happens to a society that believes it has no more lessons to learn from its enemies? The stones of Carthage may have been scattered, its harbors silted over, its name erased from official decrees, but its legacy lived on in every act of resistance to imperial arrogance, in every voice that chose mercy over might, in every thinker who dared to imagine a world beyond the logic of domination. And when, centuries later, the Arab armies swept across North Africa in the 7th century of the Common Era, they did not find a wasteland cursed by Roman fire. They found a vibrant, cosmopolitan region where Latin, Greek, and Berber coexisted, where Christian communities thrived alongside Jewish and pagan remnants, where the memory of Carthage lingered not as a wound, but as a layer in the rich sediment of human history. The new conquerors built their own cities, spoke their own tongue, worshipped their own god. But they too used the old stones, followed the old roads, farmed the old fields. They did not know they were walking where Hannibal's ancestors had once walked, where Scipio had wept, where Augustine had prayed, but the land remembered. And in that remembering, Carthage achieved its final, quiet triumph. It outlasted not only its destroyer, but the very idea that a civilization could be unmade by human hands. For as long as people till the soil of North Africa, as long as scholars debate the nature of justice and power, as long as empires rise and fall believing themselves eternal, the story of Carthage will endure, not as a footnote to Roman glory, but as its most haunting mirror. The story of Carthage and Rome, when stretched across the full arc of time, not merely from the ashes of 146 before the Common Era to the twilight of the Western Roman Empire, but into the medieval centuries and beyond, reveals a truth far more enduring than any military campaign or political decree. That civilizations are not truly erased by fire or sword, but only transformed, their essence migrating into language, law, ritual, and the unspoken habits of daily life, waiting for the right moment to reassert their presence in new forms. Long after the last Roman legate had departed North Africa, long after the Vandal kingdom had risen and fallen, long after the Byzantine reconquest had briefly restored imperial rule only to lose it again to the tides of history, the memory of Carthage persisted, not in grand monuments or official chronicles, but in the names of villages, in the design of wells, in the proverbs spoken by farmers who knew nothing of Punic script yet repeated wisdom that traced its roots to the counsels of ancient Carthaginian elders. The Berber peoples of the Maghreb, who had lived alongside the Carthaginians for centuries as allies, subjects, and sometimes rivals, absorbed Punic religious symbols into their own cosmology, blending the sign of Tanit with indigenous feminine deities of fertility and protection. The palm tree, once a sacred emblem in Carthaginian temples, became a recurring motif in Amazigh tattoos and woven textiles, its fronds symbolizing not only abundance but resilience, the ability to bend in the desert wind without breaking. This was not conscious preservation, it was cultural osmosis, the quiet work of time that refuses to honor the boundaries drawn by conquerors. Even the Arabic name for the region Ifriqiya, from which the modern word Africa derives, bears the phonetic echo of Africa, the Roman name for the province centered on Carthage, which itself may have originated from the Latinized form of a Punic or Berber word meaning cave dweller or southern land, linking the identity of an entire continent to a city that Rome tried to unmake. When the Islamic conquests reached North Africa in the 7th century of the Common Era, the Arab generals did not encounter a cultural void. They encountered a layered world where Roman law coexisted with Berber customary practice, where Christian bishops debated theology in Latin, while their congregations spoke a vernacular that mixed African romance with Punic remnants, where the ruins of Carthage stood not as a cursed wasteland, but as a source of building material and local legend. The early Muslim historians, such as al-Bakri and Ibn Khaldun centuries later, recorded tales of a great city that once ruled the sea, whose wealth was so vast that its kings paved roads with silver, and whose ships sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the unknown ocean. These stories, though embellished, preserved the core truth of Carthage's maritime dominance, even as the religious and political context shifted entirely. The new rulers did not seek to revive Carthage as a political entity. They had their own imperial vision, centered on Damascus and later Baghdad, but they respected the land's fertility and strategic position, founding new cities like Kairouan not far from the old Punic heartland, drawing on the same agricultural knowledge, the same water management systems, the same understanding of wind and tide that had made Carthage great. And in doing so, they unknowingly continued a tradition of synthesis that Carthage itself had pioneered centuries before, blending Phoenician seafaring with Berber pastoralism, Egyptian religious imagery with Mesopotamian astronomy, Greek philosophy with local legal customs. Carthage had never been a monolith. It had always been a crossroads, and crossroads by their nature cannot be permanently closed. Even in Europe, where the memory of Carthage was filtered through Roman propaganda for over a millennium, the narrative began to shift during the Renaissance, when scholars rediscovered Polybius, Livy, and Appian not as infallible authorities, but as products of their time, shaped by the biases of the empire they served. Thinkers like Machiavelli, while praising Roman discipline, also noted the self-destructive consequences of unchecked ambition, a lesson he drew directly from the Punic Wars. Later, during the Enlightenment, philosophers such as Montesquieu used the contrast between Rome and Carthage to explore the nature of commercial versus martial societies, arguing that Carthage's focus on trade and negotiation made it more modern, more rational, and ultimately more vulnerable to a state like Rome that glorified war as a virtue in itself. This reinterpretation laid the groundwork for modern archaeology, which in the 19th and 20th centuries began to uncover the physical truth beneath the Roman myth. Excavations at Carthage, first by European consuls digging haphazardly for artifacts, later by systematic teams from UNESCO and Tunisian institutions, revealed a city not of child-sacrificing fanatics, but of sophisticated urban planners, skilled metallurgists, and cosmopolitan merchants who maintained trading posts from Iberia to West Africa. The so-called Tophet, once cited as proof of mass infant sacrifice, was reinterpreted by many scholars as a sacred infant cemetery used in times of crisis, not routine ritual, a practice attested in other ancient cultures, including Israelite traditions referenced in the Hebrew Bible. These findings did not exonerate Carthage of all its complexities. No ancient society was purely virtuous, but they shattered the caricature that Rome had carefully constructed to justify its annihilation. And so, in the fullness of time, Carthage achieved a form of justice that no Roman general could have foreseen. It was not restored by force, but resurrected by truth. Today, on the outskirts of modern Tunis, the ruins of Carthage are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited not only by tourists but by students, historians, and Tunisians themselves who see in its stones not just the legacy of an ancient enemy of Rome, but a foundational chapter in their own national story. The hill of Biasa, where Scipio wept, now hosts a museum that displays Punic stelae alongside Roman mosaics, telling a narrative of coexistence as much as conflict. School children learn about Hannibal not as a monster, but as a strategic genius who crossed the Alps with elephants and nearly changed the course of world history. And in the quiet courtyards of Tunisian homes, the scent of orange blossoms and the sound of the call to prayer mingle with the distant echo of a deeper past, a past that includes the hum of Phoenician shipwrights, the clink of Carthaginian coins, the whispered prayers to gods whose names are now lost but whose presence lingers in the land. Rome's destruction of Carthage was, in the short term, total. But history is not measured in sieges or senatorial decrees. It is measured in endurance, in the slow accumulation of memory, in the quiet refusal of a place to be forgotten. And in that measure, Carthage did not merely survive, it transcended. It became a symbol not of what was lost, but of what cannot be lost, the human capacity to rebuild, to remember, to weave the threads of the past into the fabric of the future, no matter how thoroughly an empire tries to cut them. The lesson for all who wield power is written not in marble, but in dust, dust that once covered Carthaginian streets, that once filled the lungs of the last defenders, that now blows gently across a landscape that has seen empires rise and fall like waves on the shore, each believing itself eternal, each proven wrong by time. And in that dust, if one listens closely, one can still hear the question Scipio asked so long ago, echoing not as a lament but as a warning. Could this one day happen to us? The question that Scipio Aemilianus posed on that windswept hill, overlooking the burning city of Carthage in the year 146 before the Common Era, was not merely rhetorical, nor was it confined to the anxieties of a single moment in Roman history. It was a prophetic inquiry that would reverberate through the corridors of every empire that followed, from Constantinople to London, from Madrid to Washington, each in its own time convinced of its permanence, its righteousness, its immunity to the fates that befell those it deemed inferior or obsolete. Scipio's tears were not shed for Carthage alone. They were shed for the future of Rome, for the republic he loved, for the virtues of restraint, humility, and civic discipline that he saw slipping away in the smoke of total victory. He understood, with a clarity rare among conquerors, that the moment a civilization decides it no longer needs to learn from its adversaries, that it can simply erase them and thereby secure its own eternity, it has already begun its descent into moral and political decay. This insight, buried beneath centuries of triumphal narratives and imperial self-congratulation, would only resurface when Rome itself lay in ruins, when its aqueducts ran dry, its forums were overgrown with weeds, and its legions were memories recited by monks in distant monasteries. But by then, the pattern had already been set, not just for Rome, but for the very template of imperial overreach. The belief that absolute security can be achieved through annihilation, that enemies can be permanently removed rather than managed, that history has an end point where one power stands alone, unchallenged forever. This illusion has seduced rulers and republics alike throughout the ages, and each time it has led not to peace, but to fragility, to societies so dependent on external threats for cohesion that they collapse into civil strife the moment those threats vanish or evolve beyond recognition. What makes the story of Carthage especially poignant is that its destruction was unnecessary, not in the eyes of Roman paranoia, which had elevated Cato's obsession into state doctrine, but in the cold calculus of realpolitik. Carthage had no army to speak of, no navy, no foreign alliances, no desire for war. It had become a peaceful, prosperous trading city that posed less of a threat to Rome than did many of Rome's own client kings, who routinely betrayed their oaths, switched sides, and funded rebellions when it suited their interests. Yet Rome spared those kings, played them against one another, and incorporated them into the imperial system because they understood how to manage complexity. Carthage, however, was different. It was not just a rival, it was a mirror. Its success without conquest, its wealth without empire, its stability without legions, all of this challenged the foundational myth of Roman exceptionalism, which held that only through martial virtue and relentless expansion could a civilization endure. To allow Carthage to thrive peacefully was to admit that Rome's path was not the only path, that there were other ways to organize society, to generate wealth, to command respect. And that admission was intolerable to a Senate that had come to equate difference with danger. Thus, the decision to destroy Carthage was not a response to reality, but a defense of ideology, a desperate attempt to preserve a worldview that could not survive contact with an alternative. This dynamic, too, would repeat itself endlessly in human history, the powerful destroying the merely different, not because they are threatened, but because their self-image requires it. And yet, despite Rome's best efforts, Carthage refused to disappear, not in spirit, not in legacy, not in the quiet persistence of its contributions to the world that followed. The maritime laws that governed Roman trade in the Western Mediterranean were largely inherited from Carthaginian precedents, refined over centuries of Punic navigation across treacherous seas. The very concept of a commercial treaty, binding, reciprocal, enforced by mutual interest rather than military threat, was a Carthaginian innovation that Rome adopted and expanded, even as it denied its origins. When Roman merchants sailed to Iberia or Gaul, they followed routes first charted by Carthaginian captains, used harbors first engineered by Carthaginian hands, and traded goods whose value had been established in Carthaginian markets. The economic infrastructure of the Western Empire, in other words, was built upon a Punic skeleton. Even the Latin word for money, pecunia, derives from pecus, meaning cattle, reflecting Rome's pastoral origins. But the systems of credit, debt, and long-distance finance that made imperial commerce possible owed far more to the mercantile genius of Carthage than to the agrarian simplicity of early Rome. This unacknowledged debt was emblematic of a larger truth. Empires often conquer civilizations whose sophistication they secretly envy, whose knowledge they exploit, and whose memory they erase, not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to threaten the conqueror's sense of superiority. In the end, the true tragedy of Carthage is not that it was destroyed, but that its destruction was so complete that the world lost not only a city, but a perspective, a way of seeing human organization that prioritized trade over war, negotiation over domination, interdependence over isolation. Had Carthage survived as a sovereign entity into the imperial age, even as a client state, it might have served as a counterweight to Rome's increasingly militarized worldview, a living reminder that peace could be more profitable than conquest, that diplomacy could be more enduring than force. Instead, Rome chose solitude in supremacy, and in doing so, it cut itself off from the very dialogue that might have saved it from its own excesses. The Republic did not fall because it lacked enemies. It fell because it had no one left to challenge its assumptions, no mirror to reflect its flaws, no rival to spur it toward renewal. Carthage, in its final years, was not a threat. It was an opportunity for Rome to evolve beyond the logic of total war, to embrace a more mature form of power that did not require the erasure of the other. That opportunity was rejected, and the consequences unfolded over centuries, not in sudden collapse but in slow corrosion. The erosion of civic virtue, the rise of autocracy, the commodification of citizenship, the replacement of public service with personal ambition. By the time the emperors ruled from gilded palaces, the republic Scipio had wept for was already a ghost, and the ashes of Carthage had long since blown across the Mediterranean, settling not as dust, but as seeds of memory, of resilience, of a truth that no empire, no matter how mighty, can ever fully extinguish, that civilizations are not measured by how completely they destroy their enemies, but by how wisely they choose to live with them. The echoes of Carthage's fate extend far beyond the shores of North Africa and the annals of classical antiquity. They ripple through the very structure of how modern nations conceive of security, rivalry, and the moral boundaries of power. In the centuries since Rome reduced Carthage to rubble, countless regimes have stood at their own versions of the Biasa Hill, gazing upon a vanquished adversary, and believing that total eradication would guarantee eternal peace, only to discover, often too late, that the void left by destruction is far more dangerous than the presence of a contained rival. The logic that animated Cato the Elder, Carthage must be destroyed, has resurfaced in every age under new names and new justifications. Manifest destiny in the 19th century, ideological purification in the 20th, preemptive warfare in the 21st. Each time the argument follows the same arc. The enemy is not merely hostile but inherently irredeemable. Coexistence is impossible. Mercy is a luxury that invites future betrayal, and only absolute, irreversible elimination can ensure safety. Yet history, with its cruel patience, consistently reveals the flaw in this reasoning, that the act of total destruction does not end conflict, it transforms it. It shifts the battlefield from the external world to the internal psyche of the victor, where paranoia, arrogance, and moral exhaustion take root and flourish. Rome, having silenced Carthage, found itself increasingly unable to tolerate dissent within its own ranks. Without an external mirror to reflect its excesses, it turned inward, devouring its own leaders in a cycle of purges, civil wars, and autocratic consolidation that the Republic's founders could scarcely have imagined. This is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. Empires that eliminate all meaningful opposition do not achieve stability. They achieve stagnation, followed by fragility, followed by collapse. The presence of a rival, however diminished, serves as a check on hubris, a reminder that power is conditional, that history is not a straight line toward triumph, but a winding path where fortune favors the adaptable, not the absolute. What makes Carthage's story uniquely instructive is that it was not destroyed for what it had done in its final decades, but for what it had once been, and for what it might have become again. The Carthage of the Third Punic War was a shell of its former self, stripped of military power, forbidden from waging war, burdened by reparations, and focused entirely on agricultural and commercial recovery. It posed no threat to Rome's dominance. If anything, it served Roman interests by providing grain, olive oil, and tax revenue without demanding military protection or political entanglement. Yet this very success became its death sentence. To Roman eyes, a Carthage that could recover so quickly from utter defeat was not a testament to human resilience, but a warning of latent strength, an indication that the Punic spirit had not been broken, that the memory of Hannibal still lived in the blood of its people, that given time and opportunity, Carthage might yet rise again. And in the zero-sum calculus of imperial paranoia, potential was indistinguishable from intent. The Roman Senate did not wait for Carthage to act. It acted to ensure Carthage never could. This preemptive logic, so seductive in its apparent prudence, is among the most corrosive forces in political life, because it replaces evidence with fear, deliberation with dogma, and justice with expediency. Once a state accepts that future threats justify present annihilation, there is no logical stopping point. Every neighbor becomes a suspect, every recovery a rebellion, every act of self-preservation a declaration of war. Rome's destruction of Carthage was thus not an isolated act of cruelty, but the inauguration of a doctrine, one that would haunt its own future and echo through the halls of every power that followed. And yet, against all odds, Carthage endured, not as a political entity, but as a moral counterpoint, a silent witness to the cost of absolute victory. Its legacy lived on in the fields that continued to feed empires, in the legal customs that shaped Mediterranean trade, in the intellectual traditions that gave birth to some of the most profound theological and philosophical insights of late antiquity. Even in its absence, Carthage remained a presence, a question posed to every generation that claims to have no more lessons to learn from its enemies. The modern world, with its own doctrines of preemptive strikes, regime change, and cultural erasure, would do well to remember that Rome's greatest mistake was not in defeating Carthage, but in believing that victory required annihilation. True security, as Scipio seemed to understand in his moment of sorrow, does not come from the absence of rivals, but from the strength of one's own institutions, the depth of one's own values, and the wisdom to know that even the fiercest enemy may one day become a teacher, if only we leave them alive to speak. Carthage, though silenced, has never stopped speaking. Its voice is in the wind that sweeps across the ruins of Baissa, in the olive trees that still bear fruit on soil once declared cursed, in the quiet resilience of peoples who, throughout history, have refused to be unmade by the will of empires. And as long as that voice is heard, even as a whisper, it serves as a reminder that no civilization is so great that it cannot fall, and no act of destruction so total that it cannot be undone by time, truth, and the unyielding persistence of memory. The silence that followed the fall of Carthage in the year 146 before the Common Era was not merely the absence of voices from the streets, the markets, or the temples. It was a silence imposed by design, a deliberate erasure of language, law, and lineage, intended to sever not only the present from the past, but the future from any possibility of return. Roman policy sought to extinguish Carthage so completely that even its memory would become a phantom, a cautionary tale told only in Roman terms, stripped of nuance, agency, or dignity. Yet silence, like destruction, is never as absolute as its architects imagined. Sound finds its way through cracks in the wall, memory seeps through the floorboards of history, and the voices of the erased return not in shouts, but in whispers, in the lullabies mothers sang to their children in a tongue no census would record, in the names given to newborns that echoed Punic ancestors, in the way farmers marked the seasons with rituals that predated both Roman calendars and Carthaginian treaties. These were not acts of open resistance, for open resistance invites annihilation. They were acts of quiet continuity, the kind that cannot be legislated away because they live not in public decrees but in the unguarded moments of daily life. And it is precisely in these moments, in the turning of soil, in the grinding of grain, in the lighting of a lamp at dusk, that civilizations survive their own destruction. Carthage was not rebuilt in a day, nor by a single emperor's decree. It was rebuilt grain by grain, word by word, generation by generation, by people who never knew they were carrying its legacy, yet did so in every choice that honored the land, the sea, and the intricate web of relationships that had once made their ancestors masters of the Western Mediterranean. This resilience was not passive, it was deeply practical. The Carthaginians had always been pragmatists, traders, not ideologues, negotiators, not fanatics. Their religion, often misrepresented as bloodthirsty by Greek and Roman sources, was in truth a complex system of vows and obligations designed to maintain balance between the human and divine realms, rooted in the practical needs of a seafaring people who depended on favorable winds, safe harbors, and bountiful harvests. When their temples were torn down, their priests scattered, and their sacred texts lost, the underlying values did not vanish. They migrated into new forms, into the Christian emphasis on covenant and sacrifice, into the Berber reverence for natural springs and mountain peaks, into the Islamic concept of baraka, the divine blessing that flows through places, people, and acts of generosity. Even the Carthaginian practice of recording commercial contracts on perishable materials, a method dismissed by Romans as ephemeral compared to their own stone inscriptions, reflected a worldview that valued flexibility over permanence, relationships over rigid law, a perspective that would resurface centuries later in the oral legal traditions of North African communities, where trust and reputation mattered more than written proof. This was not backwardness. It was a different kind of sophistication, one that understood that human systems must breathe if they are to endure. Rome, in its obsession with control, could not comprehend this. It mistook adaptability for weakness, dialogue for deceit, and commercial acumen for moral corruption. And in doing so, it missed the chance to learn from a civilization that had mastered the art of thriving without conquest, a lesson that, had it been heeded, might have spared Rome from the very fate it inflicted upon Carthage, the slow unraveling of its own foundations under the weight of its own rigidity. Today, as archaeologists sift through the layers of Carthage's ruins, they do not find only evidence of destruction, they find evidence of return. Beneath the Roman Forum, they uncover Punic foundations. Beneath the Vandal palace, they find Roman mosaics. Beneath the Byzantine church, they find Carthaginian cisterns. Each layer speaks not of replacement, but of renewal, of a place that has been claimed, lost, and reclaimed not by erasing what came before, but by building upon it. This is the true nature of historical memory, not a straight line, but a spiral, where the past echoes in the present in ways both visible and invisible. The modern city of Tunis, which sprawls across the ancient hinterland of Carthage, carries this legacy in its streets, its cuisine, its music, a blend of Arab, Berber, Ottoman, French, and African influences that mirrors the cosmopolitanism of Carthage itself. When Tunisians speak of resilience, of navigating between powers, of preserving identity amid occupation, they are unknowingly reciting a script first written in Punic script over 2,000 years ago. And in that continuity lies the ultimate rebuttal to Rome's act of erasure. Carthage was never gone. It was only waiting for the fire to cool, for the conquerors to grow weary, for the land to speak again. And speak it has. Not in the tongue of its ancestors, perhaps, but in the language of survival, synthesis, and silent dignity. Indeed, the story of Carthage and Rome cannot be confined to the narrow chronology of 3 wars, or the smoldering ruins of a single city in the year 146 before the Common Era. It must be understood as a sprawling, multi-millennial meditation on the nature of civilization itself, on what it means to build, to endure, to fall, and to rise again not through replication, but through transformation. To walk the land where Carthage once stood is not merely to tread upon archaeological strata of Punic, Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, and Arab occupation. It is to stand at the confluence of one of humanity's oldest and most persistent questions. Can a people be unmade? Can a culture be so thoroughly erased that not even its shadow remains? Rome, in its moment of supreme confidence, believed the answer was yes. It believed that by tearing down every wall, silencing every voice, scattering every survivor, and forbidding the very name of Carthage from official memory, it could excise an entire civilization from the body of history as one might cut out a diseased organ. Yet time, that most patient of judges, has rendered a different verdict, not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow, steady persistence of what cannot be destroyed. The relationship between a people and their land, the transmission of knowledge through practice rather than text, the quiet adaptation of identity in the face of enforced silence. Carthage did not return with fanfare or armies. It returned through the hands of farmers who planted olives in the same patterns their ancestors had used, through the eyes of sailors who still read the stars to navigate the Gulf of Tunis, through the hearts of mothers who sang songs whose melodies predated Latin, Greek, and even Punic script. This is not myth. It is the quiet arithmetic of cultural survival, where what is lost in writing is preserved in doing, where memory is not stored in books but in the body, in the rhythm of labor, in the taste of bread baked with grains grown on ancient soil. Consider the sheer scope of Carthaginian achievement, not as Rome portrayed it, as a cunning, deceitful, child-sacrificing cabal of merchants, but as it truly was, one of the most innovative and adaptive civilizations of the ancient world. Founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre around the year 814 before the Common Era, according to later Roman and Greek reckoning, Carthage was never merely a colony. It became the center of a vast maritime network that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the tin mines of Cornwall, from the silver-rich hills of southern Iberia to the coral reefs of Sardinia. Its ships, built with a revolutionary double-hulled design that allowed them to carry massive cargoes while withstanding the treacherous storms of the western Mediterranean, were the freighters of their age, moving goods, people, and ideas across a sea that roamed. For much of its early history, viewed with suspicion and fear, Carthage did not conquer through legions. It connected through commerce. It did not impose its gods by force. It absorbed local deities into its pantheon, recognizing that spiritual authority, like economic power, flourished through inclusion rather than exclusion. Its government, a complex blend of oligarchic councils, elected suffetes, judges, and popular assemblies, was described by Aristotle as a model of balanced constitution, neither pure democracy nor pure tyranny, but a system that managed factional interests through negotiation and shared interest. When Hannibal crossed the Alps with his army of Celts, Iberians, Numidians, and Carthaginians, he did so not as a tyrant demanding obedience, but as a leader who had earned the loyalty of diverse peoples through respect, fairness, and shared purpose. This was the true threat Carthage posed to Rome, not its military might, which was ultimately outmatched, but its alternative vision of power. Decentralized, pluralistic, rooted in mutual benefit rather than domination. It was this vision that Rome could not tolerate, because to acknowledge its validity would have been to admit that Roman supremacy was not ordained by the gods, but contingent on historical circumstance, and that other paths to greatness were possible. And so, in the aftermath of the Third Punic War, Rome did not merely destroy a city. It sought to destroy an idea. The idea that a civilization could thrive without legions, without conquest, without the constant assertion of martial virtue. The Senate's decree that Carthage be abandoned, its fields supposedly salted, though no archaeological evidence supports literal salting, its name struck from treaties, was not just a military order. It was an act of epistemological violence, an attempt to rewrite the very rules of what counted as civilization. In the Roman worldview, only those who fought like Romans, ruled like Romans, and died like Romans were worthy of remembrance. Carthage, with its emphasis on trade, diplomacy, and cultural hybridity, did not fit this mold, and so it had to be unmade. But ideas, like seeds, do not die when buried, they wait. And in the centuries that followed, the Carthaginian way of being, pragmatic, cosmopolitan, adaptive, would reemerge not in the form of a rival state, but in the DNA of the Mediterranean world itself. The Roman Empire, for all its military glory, could not feed itself without African grain, could not finance its legions without African olive oil, could not maintain its urban centers without the agricultural surplus generated by North African estates that operated on land management principles first perfected by Carthaginian agronomists. Even the famed Roman road system, so often cited as evidence of imperial engineering genius, followed in many places the older Punic trade routes that had linked the coast to the interior for centuries. The empire that destroyed Carthage became dependent on the very region it had sought to sterilize, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, a necessity born of Carthaginian foresight in cultivating a land others had dismissed as marginal. This dependency was more than economic, it was intellectual and spiritual. When Christianity spread through North Africa in the first centuries of the Common Era, it found fertile ground not because the population was passive or easily converted, but because the region had long been a crossroads of religious thought, where Egyptian, Greek, Berber, and Punic beliefs had mingled to create a rich tapestry of spiritual inquiry. The rigor, intensity, and moral absolutism that characterized North African Christianity, seen in the Donatist schism, in Tertullian's fiery defense of purity, in Augustine's profound explorations of grace and sin, were not imported from Rome. They were born of a local tradition that valued depth over spectacle, conviction over conformity. Augustine himself, though a bishop of the Catholic Church, never fully abandoned the African emphasis on interiority, on the soul's direct confrontation with truth, a perspective that owed more to the introspective traditions of the Mediterranean South than to the legalistic abstractions of Roman theology. His entire project in City of God, a radical reimagining of history as a struggle not between empires, but between two loves, love of self unto contempt of God, and love of God unto contempt of self, was a direct response to the fall of Rome, but it was also a quiet vindication of the Carthaginian worldview, that true order is not imposed by armies, but cultivated in the human heart. In this sense, Carthage achieved its most profound victory not on the battlefield, but in the realm of ideas, by producing thinkers who would help dismantle the very ideology that had sought to erase them. Even in the modern era, the legacy of Carthage endures in ways both subtle and profound. The very concept of Africa as a continent, rather than a Roman province, traces its etymological roots to the name given to the Carthaginian heartland. The economic strategies of modern Mediterranean states, balancing trade, tourism, and agriculture in a fragile ecological zone, mirror the Carthaginian approach to resource management. The diplomatic efforts of post-colonial nations to assert sovereignty without military parity reflect the same pragmatism that once defined Carthaginian foreign policy. And in the global struggle to preserve cultural diversity in the face of homogenizing forces, whether imperial, corporate, or ideological, the story of Carthage stands as a testament to the resilience of difference, to the fact that even the most thorough erasure leaves traces that can be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reclaimed. Archaeologists today use ground-penetrating radar, drone mapping, an isotopic analysis of human remains not just to reconstruct buildings, but to recover voices, the diets of ordinary Carthaginians, the origins of their pottery, the diseases they suffered, the rituals they practiced in private. Each discovery chips away at the Roman narrative, revealing a society far more complex, humane, and innovative than the caricature of perfidious merchants that Cato and his successors propagated. And yet, perhaps the most enduring lesson of Carthage lies not in what it was, but in what it represents. The eternal tension between power that seeks to dominate and power that seeks to connect. Rome chose domination, and for centuries it appeared to succeed, building an empire that spanned 3 continents, imposing its language, its law, its calendar on a world it reshaped in its image. But empires built on domination are inherently fragile because they depend on the perpetual subjugation of the other, and subjugation breeds resentment, resistance, and eventual collapse. Carthage, by contrast, built its power on connection, on the voluntary exchange of goods, ideas, and trust. It had no empire in the Roman sense, yet its influence reached farther than many Roman legions ever did, because it offered something people wanted: prosperity without conquest, order without oppression, identity without uniformity. In our own age, as nations grapple with the limits of military power, the costs of ideological purity, and the urgent need for global cooperation, the story of Carthage offers not a blueprint but a mirror, a reflection of paths not taken, possibilities foreclosed, and wisdom lost to the flames of certainty. To remember Carthage is not to mourn a dead city. It is to rekindle a living question. What kind of world do we wish to build? One that seeks to erase its rivals, or one that learns from them? One that measures strength in destruction, or in the quiet, enduring power of creation? The stones of Carthage may be scattered, but the choice remains ours. The question of whether Carthage could have survived, not merely as a physical city, but as a sovereign political and cultural entity, into the Roman imperial age is not a matter of idle historical speculation. It is a profound inquiry into the nature of coexistence, the limits of imperial tolerance, and the possibility of a Mediterranean world shaped not by the zero-sum logic of Roman supremacy, but by a pluralistic ecology of civilizations. Had Rome chosen a different path after the Second Punic War, had Scipio Africanus's vision of a humbled but intact Carthage been honored not just in the short term, but as a lasting principle, the trajectory of Western history might have unfolded in ways almost impossible to imagine from our current vantage point. A surviving Carthage would not have remained static. It would have evolved, as all civilizations do, adapting to the new realities of Roman hegemony while preserving its core identity as a maritime, mercantile, and cosmopolitan society. It might have become a client kingdom like Armenia or Judea, or a federated republic like the later Swiss cantons under the Holy Roman Empire, or even a semi-autonomous province with its own legal code, language, and religious institutions, much like the Greek cities of Asia Minor that retained significant cultural autonomy under Roman rule. In such a scenario, Carthage would not have posed a military threat. Its experience with Hannibal's campaign and the crushing aftermath of Zama had already taught its leaders the futility of direct confrontation with Rome. But it would have served as a vital counterweight to Roman ideological monolithism, a living testament to the fact that there was more than one way to organize human society, to generate wealth, to navigate the complexities of international relations. Imagine, for a moment, a Roman Senate in the 1st century before the Common Era where Carthaginian envoys sat not as supplicants, but as partners, where debates over grain supplies, naval security in the Western Mediterranean, or trade tariffs with Iberia included voices that spoke not only of Roman interests, but of Punic perspectives rooted in centuries of maritime experience. Imagine Roman merchants in Ostia learning Punic alongside Greek, not as a relic of a dead enemy, but as a practical language of commerce, much as Italian merchants in the Renaissance learned Arabic to trade with the Islamic world. Imagine a Mediterranean where Roman law governed political allegiance, but Carthaginian commercial law governed contracts, shipping, and insurance. Two systems coexisting, complementing, even competing in ways that spurred innovation rather than suppression. This is not fantasy. It is the model that Rome itself used successfully with the Greeks, whose philosophical, artistic, and scientific traditions were not only tolerated but actively absorbed, celebrated, and institutionalized within Roman education and elite culture. The difference with Carthage was not its inherent nature, but Roman perception. The Greeks, for all their political fragmentation, were seen as culturally superior in arts and letters, their civilization a worthy ancestor to Roman refinement. The Carthaginians, by contrast, were seen as alien, not merely foreign but fundamentally other, Semitic in origin, Eastern in sensibility, mercantile in ethos, and thus suspect in a society that equated virtue with land ownership, agriculture, and military service. This bias, deeply embedded in Roman self-conception, made coexistence psychologically and politically difficult, even when it was strategically and economically advantageous. And yet the cost of that exclusion was immense, not just for Carthage but for Rome itself. By eliminating its most sophisticated rival, Rome deprived itself of a source of intellectual friction, of alternative models of governance, of checks on its own assumptions about the natural order of things. The Roman Republic, in its healthiest centuries, had thrived on internal debate between patricians and plebeians, optimates and populars, traditionalists and reformers. But without an external counterpoint, that debate grew increasingly shrill, increasingly detached from reality, until it devolved into violence. The Gracchi brothers were not killed because they threatened foreign powers, but because they threatened the domestic status quo, and there was no external perspective to mediate that conflict, no Carthaginian envoy to whisper to a Roman consul that land reform might be preferable to civil war. Similarly, the slide into autocracy under the emperors was not merely the result of individual ambition, but of a political culture that had lost its capacity for self-correction. When Augustus declared the restoration of the Republic while holding all real power in his hands, there was no rival civilization to point out the contradiction, no alternative model of leadership to suggest that power could be shared, rotated, or constrained. Carthage, had it survived, might not have prevented these developments, but it might have tempered them by offering a different vision of what power could look like, by reminding Rome that its way was not the only way, by serving as a living archive of solutions to problems Rome had not yet encountered. Moreover, the survival of Carthage would have altered the religious and philosophical landscape of late antiquity in ways that could have reshaped the course of Western civilization. The religious syncretism that characterized the Roman Empire, where Egyptian Isis, Persian Mithras, and Syrian Atargates were worshipped alongside Jupiter and Minerva, might have included Punic deities like Tanit and Baal Hammon, not as exotic curiosities, but as integral parts of a shared Mediterranean pantheon. The theological debates that consumed the early Christian church over the nature of Christ, the role of grace, the relationship between faith and works, might have been informed by Punic concepts of divine covenant, of ritual purity, of the balance between human action and divine will. Augustine, instead of writing against the backdrop of a purely Roman Berber Christian North Africa, might have engaged with a living Punic intellectual tradition, blending its insights with Neoplatonism and scripture to produce a theology even richer and more nuanced than what we have. The very idea of a city of God might have been contrasted not only with the city of man, but with the memory of a real city, Carthage, that had tried to build a just society without claiming divine sanction for its wars. This is not to suggest that Carthaginian religion was inherently more peaceful or ethical than Roman state religion. Both were products of their time, capable of great beauty and great cruelty. but rather that diversity of religious thought fosters depth of spiritual inquiry, and that the silencing of one voice diminishes the conversation for all. Even in the realm of environmental history, the survival of Carthage might have offered lessons that Rome desperately needed but never learned. Carthaginian agriculture, as described in the fragments of Mago's treatise, was remarkably sustainable, emphasizing crop rotation, terracing, water conservation, and the integration of livestock with arable farming, practices that preserved the fertility of North African soil for centuries. Roman latifundia, by contrast, were often monocultural, extractive, and ecologically destructive, depleting the land through overgrazing and continuous grain cultivation without adequate fallow periods. The resulting soil exhaustion contributed to the economic decline of the Western Empire in its later centuries, as African grain yields plummeted just when they were needed most. Had Carthaginian agronomists remained active participants in provincial management, their methods might have been preserved and expanded, delaying or even preventing the ecological crisis that undermined Roman food security. This is a stark reminder that the destruction of a civilization is not only a cultural tragedy, it is also a practical one, a loss of knowledge that can have material consequences for generations. In the end, the destruction of Carthage was not just an act of war, it was an act of epistemicide, the deliberate elimination of a way of knowing, of organizing, of being in the world. Rome did not merely conquer a rival, it sought to conquer the very possibility of an alternative, and in doing so, it impoverished itself as much as it destroyed Carthage. The story we tell about Carthage today, of a cunning, deceitful, child-sacrificing enemy finally brought to justice by virtuous Rome, is not history, it is propaganda fossilized into myth. But beneath that myth lies a deeper truth, that Carthage was not Rome's opposite, but its mirror, its twin, its necessary other. Without Carthage, Rome lost the ability to see itself clearly. Without an adversary worthy of respect, it began to confuse power with virtue, domination with order, silence with peace. And in that confusion, the seeds of its own decline were planted, not by barbarians at the gate, but by the emptiness within. The silence that enveloped Carthage after its final destruction in the year 146 before the Common Era was never absolute, for silence imposed by force is always haunted by the echoes of what came before, echoes that persist not in grand monuments or official proclamations, but in the most intimate recesses of human life, in the way a child is named, in the pattern of a woven rug, in the scent of myrtle and olive blossoms carried on the evening breeze across the Gulf of Tunis. Rome believed it could erase Carthage by turning its temples into rubble, its archives into dust, its people into slaves or refugees, but it failed to comprehend that civilizations are not housed solely in stone and parchment. They reside in the body, in memory, in the unspoken inheritance passed from one generation to the next through gesture, taste, rhythm, and routine. The Carthaginian mother who whispered lullabies in a tongue forbidden by Roman decree did not know she was preserving a language. She only knew she was soothing her child. The farmer who planted his fields according to the phases of the moon did not believe he was defying imperial timekeeping. He simply followed the wisdom his grandfather had taught him. The artisan who carved a symbol resembling the sign of Tanit into the corner of a clay bowl was not making a political statement. He was honoring a habit of hand, a design so ingrained in his craft that he could not have avoided it if he tried. These acts, small and unrecorded, were not resistance in the conventional sense. They left no martyrs, no manifestos, no revolutions. But they were resistance nonetheless. The quiet, persistent assertion that a people cannot be unmade so long as they remember, however faintly, who they are. And it is precisely this form of resistance that empires, in their arrogance, always underestimate, because it cannot be crushed by legions or outlawed by edict. It flows like water through the cracks of control, pooling in the places where power does not think to look, in the kitchen, in the field, in the cradle. This underground continuity of Carthaginian identity did not vanish with the arrival of Christianity or Islam. It adapted, as all resilient cultures do, folding its essence into new forms while retaining its core. When North African Christians in the 3rd century of the Common Era gathered in catacombs to celebrate the Eucharist, they did so in a spirit of communal solidarity that echoed the Punic emphasis on collective obligation and sacred covenant. When Berber tribes in the Atlas Mountains maintained matrilineal inheritance patterns long after Roman law had enshrined male primogeniture, they were not rejecting Rome so much as preserving a social structure that predated both Carthage and Rome, one that Carthage itself had respected in its dealings with indigenous peoples. When Arab geographers in the 10th century of the Common Era described the ruins near Tunis as the remains of a great city that once ruled the sea, they were relying on oral traditions that had never been written down but had never been forgotten. Memory, in this sense, is not a static archive but a living river, constantly fed by new tributaries, yet carrying the same essential waters from source to sea. The modern Tunisian who takes pride in his country's strategic position at the crossroads of civilizations, who values negotiation over confrontation, who sees diversity not as a threat but as a source of strength. This person may never have read a single line about Hannibal or Hasdrubal, yet he walks in their footsteps, shaped by a cultural DNA that survived centuries of attempted erasure not through defiance, but through endurance. And this endurance holds a lesson not only for historians, but for all who wield power in the present age. In an era when nations speak of total victory, of regime change, of degrading and destroying adversaries through sanctions, surveillance, and military force, the story of Carthage serves as a cautionary tale of staggering relevance. Rome achieved what it set out to achieve. Carthage was destroyed, its people scattered, its name erased from official discourse. Yet within a century, Rome was tearing itself apart in civil wars, its republic dead, its virtues hollowed out, its future mortgaged to autocracy and spectacle. The victory over Carthage did not bring peace. It brought complacency. It removed the one force that had forced Rome to be disciplined, innovative, and self-reflective. Without an external check, internal corruption flourished. Without a rival to measure itself against, Rome began to believe its own myths of invincibility, and in that belief, it sowed the seeds of its own unraveling. This is not to romanticize Carthage. No ancient state was without its flaws, its cruelties, its blind spots, but to recognize that even flawed rivals serve a vital function in the ecosystem of power. They prevent the victor from forgetting that history is not a straight line to triumph, but a cycle of rise, hubris, and fall. The moment a civilization believes it has no more lessons to learn from its enemies is the moment it begins to die, not with a bang, but with the slow suffocation of its own moral imagination. Today, as archaeologists and historians continue to excavate the layers of Carthage, not just its ruins, but its legacy, they are not merely recovering artifacts, they are recovering possibilities. Each Punic inscription deciphered, each trade route mapped, each agricultural technique reconstructed offers a glimpse into a world that chose connection over conquest, adaptability over rigidity, pluralism over purity. These are not antiquarian curiosities. They are alternatives, reminders that the path taken was not the only path, that history is not destiny, that even in the face of overwhelming force, cultures can survive by bending without breaking. The land of Carthage, once declared cursed, now feeds millions. Its stones, once scattered, now form the foundations of museums, universities, and homes. Its memory, once suppressed, now inspires poets, philosophers, and politicians across the Maghreb and beyond. And in that rebirth, quiet, unassuming, yet undeniable, lies the ultimate verdict on Rome's act of annihilation. It failed. Not because Carthage returned as a military power, but because it returned as a presence, as a perspective, as a persistent question posed to every empire that believes it can rule forever by silencing its rivals. The true measure of a civilization is not how completely it can destroy its enemies, but how wisely it chooses to live with them, and how humbly it listens when they are gone. Carthage, though it no longer speaks in its own tongue, still has much to say. And those who walk its ruins today, whether as scholars, citizens, or seekers of truth, would do well to listen, not with the ears of conquerors, but with the hearts of those who understand that no victory is complete if it leaves the victor poorer in wisdom, compassion, and self-knowledge than before. For more than 2,000 years, the story of Carthage has lingered not as a footnote to Roman glory, but as a haunting counterpoint to the myth of invincibility, a whisper in the wind that rises from the ruins of Biasa Hill, carries across the olive groves of the Medjugorje Valley, and settles softly in the conscience of every civilization that has ever convinced itself that total victory is the same as lasting peace. Rome believed that by burning Carthage to the ground, by scattering its people, silencing its language, and forbidding its name, it had written the final chapter of a dangerous rival's existence. But history, in its patient and inexorable way, has proven otherwise. Carthage was never truly gone. It lived in the soil that continued to yield grain for empires that knew nothing of Punic prayers. It lived in the aqueducts that carried water through channels first mapped by Carthaginian engineers. It lived in the legal customs that shaped Mediterranean trade long after Roman law had faded into medieval memory. It lived in the eyes of North African children who inherited a resilience they could not name but could not deny. The city may have fallen, its temples may have crumbled, its fleet may have vanished beneath the waves, but its spirit endured, not in defiance but in continuity, not in rebellion but in the quiet, unbroken thread of human memory that no army, no Senate decree, no ideology of erasure can ever fully sever. And so, as we stand at the end of this long journey through smoke and stone, through triumph and tears, through the rise and fall of empires built on the illusion of permanence, we are left not with a simple moral, but with a question, one that Scipio Aemilianus asked as he watched Carthage burn, one that echoes through every age where power believes it has no more lessons to learn. Can a civilization survive its own victory? Can it remain virtuous when it no longer fears defeat? Can it remember humility when the world kneels before it? Rome could not. And in that failure, it gave us not only its own decline, but a warning etched in the ashes of a city it tried to unmake. Carthage, in its destruction, became something far more enduring than a rival. It became a mirror that shows us, even today, the cost of seeing the world in terms of enemies to be erased rather than neighbors to be understood. A mirror that reflects the truth that no amount of power can protect a society that has lost its capacity for self-reflection, for mercy, for the wisdom to know that even the fiercest adversary may carry a truth we need to hear. The ruins of Carthage still stand on the outskirts of modern Tunis, not as a monument to hatred, but as a testament to endurance. Tourists walk among them, scholars study them, children play near them, and in each footstep, each glance, each quiet moment of contemplation, the story continues. Not as a call to revive the past, but as an invitation to imagine a different future. One where strength is measured not by how completely we destroy our rivals, but by how wisely we choose to live alongside them. Where security is built not on annihilation, but on understanding. Where history is not a weapon to justify conquest, but a teacher to guide us away from the very mistakes that doomed those who came before. The stones do not speak in words, but they speak nonetheless, in the rustle of olive leaves, in the lap of waves against the ancient harbor walls, in the silence that follows the telling of a story too long forgotten. And if we listen closely, we may still hear the voice of a civilization that Rome tried to erase, not saying, "Remember me," but asking gently, persistently, "What will you choose?" Thank you for walking this long road with me through fire, memory, and time. If this story moved you, challenged you, or gave you a new way to see the past and the present, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your questions, your own reflections on power, memory, and what it means to truly endure. And if you believe in deep, thoughtful storytelling that dares to question the narratives we've been handed, consider subscribing. Not just for more history, but for more truth, more connection, more of the kind of content that reminds us we are all part of a story far larger than ourselves. Until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, and never forget. The most powerful empires are not those that erase their enemies, but those that learn from them.